Hey, in this build, I'm going to be showing you how I took this old rusty propane tank and turned it into a mini wood stove for heating my garage. To start this project, you can see me breaking off the valve for the propane tank, and this is important to basically let out all the vapors. Even though this tank was completely used up, it's still important to get those last vapors because they can be obviously very flammable. So to make sure the tank is completely purged of any leftover propane, I went ahead and filled it up with water a couple times and drained it out just to make sure there was nothing left over. Once I had completely emptied it of any flammable propane, I then basically just cleaned it up, taking off some of the outer support pieces that I wasn't going to be using for my wood stove. Once I had all those pieces off, I just came back with a regular grinding wheel to clean up some of the bumps and imperfections all over the tank that were left after removing those pieces. And this left me with a pretty clean cylinder bottle to begin turning into my wood stove. Here I'm using some blue painter's tape. That gives me some nice, crisp, clean lines to cut along. And these cuts are creating the opening, which will then be fitted with the door for my wood stove. The first opening I built ended up being a little on the small side, so I decided to open it up a little more just to fit slightly larger pieces of wood in later on. After I had created that opening, I had some old pieces of bed frame that I was using to trim out this opening. That way I could basically create a flat rectangular plane within this circular bottle shape. So here's me just welding on those pieces to create that final structure where the door will eventually fit into. When working with this old bed frame, there is a bunch of paint all over the frame, and it's important to grind off all that paint so that you can get some clean welds. Now, these welds aren't super structural by any means, but I still wanted to get a decent adhesion, and for that reason, I had to do a bunch of extra grinding. If you buy angle iron, then all power to you. You don't have to take these steps. But for me, I was working on a more budget friendly and project where I could just use the things accessible to me in my garage at the time. So I ended up just taking the extra time to grind off a bunch of paint. But in the end, I think it was worth it because I was able to get fairly decent welds that would hold up. It wasn't only good for the welds, but using just the things I had on hand also forced me to be a little bit more creative and let me complete this whole project for under $20. Once I had created the main door frame for loading the wood, I decided to move on to creating the upper hole where the smoke and chimney for the wood stove will be. And to do this, I just used a cutoff wheel to cut out a circle in the top of the propane tank. Once I had done that, I was able to add in some perforations along this circle and slowly bend each tab up so that it fit a 6-inch single wall stovepipe. Once I had a good fit, I was able to then go ahead and weld on the 6-inch stovepipe coupler. And this was a little bit of a tricky weld just because the stovepipe wall is very thin and the propane tank metal is fairly thick in comparison. So the difference in thicknesses of the metal can cause you to sometimes burn through the thinner metal if you're not careful. I wanted an easy way to remove all the ash from my wood stove after using it for prolonged periods of time, so I decided to add a 2-inch pipe fitting and cap to the bottom of the propane tank. That would make it easy without taking apart the entire wood stove to hopefully remove the ash during use. Once I had the ash removal cap installed, I knew about how high I wanted my wood stove to sit and was able to use some old pieces of rebar I just had lying around to make some simple basic legs that would keep this wood stove off of the surface it's sitting on. The next step was creating the door for the wood stove to keep all that heat and smoke in the stove and not have it all pour out. So I originally was looking for some hinges but couldn't find any, so was sorting through some of my tubing and piping stack and was able to find a rod and tube that fit together nicely. I had to clean off some of the paint on the tubing, but after that I had the materials I needed to begin building my door. I took some measurements on the opening I created and then cut a piece out of a steel sheet that I had to start me off on the door building process. Once I had that sheet cut, I then took some pieces of flat bar stock I had and trimmed out the door. Because the pieces of sheet metal I had weren't very thick, I wanted to use this flat bar to reinforce the door. I also might end up putting some glass in this wood stove at some point, so this would give it a nice place to sit, kind of like a frame. Once the basic door was welded up, I added on some small pieces of angle iron and used my angle grinder just to clean everything up. I then was testing out the fit and getting an idea for how I could get the hinge to work with the tubing and rod I had. Once I had a good concept of where all the hinge pieces needed to be and how they were going to fit, I added some t-shirt material to act as a temporary spacer that would allow my gasket to fit later on, and went ahead and welded those pieces into place. After I had the door secured and the hinge on, the next step was creating a handle. To do this, I just used a nut and bolt along with a piece of metal rod. Most wood stoves are regulated based on the amount of air that's let in for combustion to take place. So for my wood stove, I wanted to create an air intake, and to do that I opened up a hole on the right side of my propane tank. Over that opening I welded on the other half of my 2-inch pipe coupling. This gave me a flat surface that the door for my air intake could mate up against to provide a better seal than would have been achievable if I was trying to mate against the curved body of the propane tank. Finally, I added a handle and a spring to the air intake. This let me adjust the opening easily and have its position be held without any other moving parts needed. So here's just a quick walk around look at my wood stove once all the welding has pretty much been complete. And you can see that it's looking a little rough, but all the major components are there. Inside you can see where the hole is to remove the ash. The door opens nice and easily. The air intake is easily adjustable and holds its position with the tension being put on it with the spring being used. Everything is basically in place. Now it's just time for some final touches to really make this thing look a little better, and hopefully it's going to perform just fine. Before I painted the wood stove, I wanted to give it a test run to make sure that I didn't need to add any other features and that it would work well as is. So I decided to light a little fire in it and see how it would go. Everything went great, and as an added benefit, I ended up burning off a lot of the paint, and this made it easier to remove later on before I added some high heat paint to the stove. Removing all the paint can be a little bit of a hassle, but to make sure I got a good adhesion for my high heat paint, I went ahead and wire brushed the entire thing to make sure there wasn't a lot of extra paint residue left on there. I decided to use an old helium tank I had lying around to make a cosmetic part for the wood stove. This basically just acted to cover up some of the uglier welding I did to attach the chimney pipe. I sprayed everything down with a degreaser and wiped it off to get it as clean as possible, and then gave it a coat of Rust-Oleum high heat black spray paint to protect it from rusting, and hopefully this will last a little while before I have to repaint it. So this is the final wood stove that I've built. This is the door and how you basically load your wood. So your wood is basically just going to end up going directly in here, like so. Once you have that latched up, there's just a little latch over here that lets you close it up. How you control the fire is over here. So there's a spring-loaded air intake, and so I can just control how much air I give the fire. If I leave it all the way open, obviously it's going to get up pretty hot pretty quick, and then all the way closed if I want to choke it out and basically stop it from burning. That's how it does it. And then once you're done burning for a while, you're going to collect ash. And so to do that and get rid of it, basically you can see inside here there's a hole and everything slopes down to that area. And if I show you underneath here, you can see this cap can easily be unscrewed to empty out your ash after you've burned a couple fires. I might plan to eventually add a gasket to this door here, and in the future potentially cut out this and add in a nice piece of tempered fiberglass. I think that would make it really nice, but for now I just want to test it out as is. Thanks for watching. Be sure to stay tuned for the wood stove installation video.